The moment I saw my son sitting outside in the snow, I knew something inside me had changed. Forever. The porch light flickered above his small, shivering frame. His lips were blue, his arms wrapped tight around his chest, as if he were trying to hold in the last bit of warmth left in his body. He was wearing only a thin t-shirt and a pair of shorts in 5-degree weather. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The snow kept falling, dusting his hair, clinging to his eyelashes. I remember calling his name, my voice cracking like glass. When he turned for a weak smile, "Hi, Mom." That's when I noticed the empty inhaler in his hand. I didn't remember getting out of the car. I only knew I was suddenly kneeling beside him, wrapping my marine coat around his shoulders, hugging him. His small body trembled against me. "Why are you out here?" I asked, my voice to calm. "He looked down," Dad said. "I was making noise, and Heather wanted quiet during dinner." Inside, through the frosted window, I saw the Mark and he, his father-new wife. They sat in the golden light of the fireplace, laughing with wine glasses raised, while my son sat freezing outside. Something snapped, not in a wild way, not rage or hysteria. It was the kind of snap that comes after years of holding everything together, years of biting your tongue, years of being told you're too strict, too military, too cold. I stood up. My boots crunched through the snow. Ethan tried to stop me. "Mom, don't." But my hand was already on the doorknob. The door was locked, so I kicked it open. The sound was like a gunshot through the quiet night. Heather screamed, Mark dropped his glass, and I stepped inside, still in uniform, snow melting off my shoulders, my son's coat clutched in my hand. Mark's eyes went wide. "Sarah, what the hell?" I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just said 9 words. "Get away from my son before I forget." Mercy, you could have heard a pin drop. The fire crackled behind them, Heather's face turned white, and Mark froze in place, his hand trembling midair. Ethan stood at the door half-hidden behind me. I could hear his ragged breathing, the same way I'd heard soldiers breathe in the desert. That shallow, scared kind that comes when the body doesn't know if it's safe anymore. I took a deep breath and turned back to him. "It's okay, baby. You're coming home with me." Heather opened her mouth to protest, but I shot her a look that could have stopped a colonel mid-sentence. For a moment, no one moved. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the wind howled through the pine trees. Mark finally said, "Sarah, this is neglect." I cut in. "That's what this is." He flinched. "You can't just barge in here like I can." And I just did. I picked up Ethan's inhaler from the side table and slipped it into my pocket. My training taught me to act under pressure, decompartmentalize emotions. But in that moment, my heart was beating like it was back in combat. I took it. "Hand, get your things." "To block us, you're overreacting, Sarah. He was fine. I turned on him. "You left your son outside in 5 degrees, Mark. He could have died." He standard something about misunderstanding about Heather not meaning any harm, but she stood behind him, pale and silent, clutching her wine glass like it might protect her. I didn't yell again. I just looked at her and said quietly, "You wanted quiet during dinner. Congratulations." Ethan slipped past me, clutching his small backpack. His shoes were soaked, his fingers red. I let him outside, wrapped him in the spare blanket for my truck, and started the engine. As we drove away, he didn't say anything. He just looked out the window, watching the snow blur the world into white streaks. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other on his shoulder. "Halfway home." "Are you—" I swallow. "You never." He noted, his eyes half closed. "A dad." I didn't answer right away. The dashboard light reflected off my rank insignia, the silver oak leaf of a Marine major. I'd faced insurgents, bomb scares, and nights of waiting for soldiers who didn't make it back. but nothing in my life had ever felt as cold as seeing my son left outside that house. "I'm disappointed," I said finally, "and that's worse than mad." Ed laid his head against my arm like he used to when he was little. His breathing evened out. For the first time that night, I let myself cry, silent, controlled tears that fell and disappeared into my sleeve. I looked at him, my boy, my reason for every hard choice I'd made, and I made a silent promise. This would never happen again, not while I was alive. The next morning, I called my attorney. The next morning, the world outside was still blanketed in white, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long night of snow. Clean, untouched, deceptive in its calm. Inside me, the storm hadn't passed. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, his lips trembling, his breath fogging in the air, his little fingers gripping that empty inhaler. I'd seen soldiers freeze in desert nights, but this was different. This was my son. I made a pot of coffee, but it tasted like metal. My hands still shook. Every instinct in me, the Marine, the mother, the woman who'd been told to stay quiet for too long, was screaming to act. By noon, I'd called my attorney Linda Cooper, a tough old friend from my service years who'd switched to family law after her husband passed. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Bring me everything. Photos, notes, the inhaler." Well, after that, I got in my truck. The snow had been proud, but I still clung to the roses in silver patches. The radio played some talk show about politics, angry voices shouting over each other. I turned it off. All I could hear was the hum of the tires and the echo of Ethan's small voice. "Are you mad, Mom?" No, I wasn't mad. I was something deeper, the kind of cold anger that doesn't need to shout. As I drove, my thoughts wandered back to the last time I'd seen Mark truly happy. It was before the war, before the distance between us turned into something you couldn't measure in miles. We met at Camp Lejeune, both young, full of plans. He loved that I wore a uniform, said it made him proud. But pride doesn't always survive deployment. When I came home from my second tour, he was distant. When I came home from my third, he was gone. He'd filed for divorce while I was still overseas, using prolonged absences grounds. I didn't even fight it. I was too tired, too numb. But what broke me wasn't the divorce. It was when the judge, influenced by Mark's lawyer, gave him primary custody. He'd said, "Your son needs stability, Major Monroe, not a mother who might be deployed again." I remember standing there in my dress blues, my medals still polished, my shining, feeling like none of it mattered, like everything I'd fought for meant nothing now. Years later, that same man had left our son outside in a blizzard. I gripped the wheel tighter when I reached the gas station at the edge of town. I stopped to refuel. The clerk, a man in his 70s with a kind smile, glanced at my uniform and said, "Thank you for your service, ma'am." I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thank you for remembering." He looked at me a moment longer, maybe sensing something heavier beneath my words, but he didn't ask. He just said, "Drive safe out there, roads get slick past Mill Creek." I thanked him again and got back on the road. I thought about Ethan's future, how I wanted him to grow up knowing that kindness and courage still mattered in this world. But how do you teach that when his own father showed him the opposite? My phone buzzed. It was Linda. "We can file for emergency custody based on neglect," she said. "But I need you to stay calm. Don't go near him again until I tell you." I said I understood. I meant it. But deep down, I knew that if Mark tried to twist this, if he tried to say it was all a misunderstanding, I wouldn't stay silent this time. The Marine in me doesn't quit. By the time I got home, the sun was setting. The house felt colder than usual, even with the heater running. I lit a handle on the kitchen table, the same one Ethan made at summer camp. Red wax in a chipped glass jar. The smell of cinnamon filled the air. He was upstairs resting. I checked on him. His breathing was steady, soft. He clutched his stuffed bear, the same one I'd mailed to him from overseas. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "You're safe now." When I came back downstairs, I saw the family photos still hanging on the wall, the one from before the divorce. Mark, me, Ethan, in the middle, both of us smiling like we believed nothing could ever touch us. I thought about taking it down, but I didn't. Not yet. That smile, part of Ethan's childhood, and I wouldn't rewrite his memories, just protect his future. Outside had started again, gentle and soundless. I poured another cup of coffee, sat by the window, and entered my journal, something I hadn't done since deployment, December the 2nd. I saw what neglect looks like in its purest form, not shouting, not violence, just silence and indifference. I remembered why I joined the Marines, to stand between the helpless and the harm. I stared at the words until they bled. Then I underlined one sentence. This time, I fight at home. Tomorrow, I'd gather the evidence. I'd talk to Ethan's teachers, to the nurse who'd called me, maybe even to the neighbors. The truth was on my side, but I'd learned long ago, truth doesn't win on its own. You have to carry it like a flag through the mud. As I turned off the light, I thought of something my old commanding officer 11 said. Revenge is just anger with purpose. Justice is what happens when you turn that purpose into discipline. That night, I slept only a few hours, but when I woke, I was calm, focused. The storm inside had finally taken shape. Not wild, not reckless, just. And for the first time since that freezing night, I wasn't afraid. The next few days blurred into routine calls, paperwork, statements. But every time I looked at Ethan, the image of that night burned behind my eyes. His small body on that porch, his pale lips, the sound of wind swallowing his voice. He didn't talk about it much. That's how I knew it hurt him deeper than he could say. Trauma in kids doesn't always scream. It hides in silence. He stayed close to me, shadowing my steps around the house, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he blinked. One afternoon, I found him sitting by the window, staring out at the snow-covered yard. I asked softly, "What's on your mind?" "But?" He shrugged. "Just thinking about that night." He hesitated, then noted, "Did I do something wrong, Mom? Is that why Dad left me outside?" My heart cracked. I knelt in front of him and held his hands. "Ethan, listen to me. You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing." He blinked fast, fighting tears. He said, "I was too noisy, that I was annoying." I took a deep breath. "Ethan, you are never a burden. Never." That night, after I put him to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen. Battlefield trauma treated wounded Marines and stood in front of grieving families, but nothing compared to watching my own child question his worth. The next morning, I called the school nurse again. She confirmed she'd seen Ethan's symptoms worsening for weeks. "He comes to the nurse's office out of breath sometimes," she said. "I've called his dad a few times, but he never answers. Your son told me Mom always answers." That sentence hit me like a punch. Mom always answers. I hung up and called Linda, my attorney. "We're moving forward," I told her. She didn't argue. She just said, "We'll file first thing tomorrow." By that afternoon, I'd gathered everything. Photos of Ethan's frostbitten hands, the empty inhaler, the medical report from the nurse, and even a copy of my old custody agreement. The Marine in me had returned. Not the fighter, but the tactician. I wasn't coming at this from emotion anymore. This was a mission. That evening, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he looked at me and asked, "Are you going to make Dad mad?" I sat beside him. "Maybe. But that's not what this is about. This is about making sure you're safe." He nodded, small and solemn, the way soldiers nodded before an order. I smoothed his hair and whispered, "Sleep, Marine. You're off duty tonight." He smiled for the first time in days. When I went back downstairs, I poured myself a cup of coffee. TV played softly in the background, some family sitcom laughter echoing through the screen. It sounded foreign now. I caught my reflection in the window, my uniform jacket draped over the chair, my medals glinting faintly in the lamplight. Those medals weren't for killing, they were for protecting. And now, that mission was personal. That night, I dreamed of my deployment in Helmand Province, the desert wind, the dust, the long nights on watch. I remembered one boy we rescued after a bombing, half his face burned, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't cry, just stared at us with the same quiet that Ethan had that night on the porch. I'd promised that child he'd be safe. Now I was making the same promise again, this time to my own blood. The next morning, I dressed in civilian clothes and drove to Linda's office. She looked up as I entered. "You look like you're about to lead a platoon," she said. "Feels like it." She handed me a folder. "We're filing for emergency custody, neglect, and endangerment. It's not guaranteed, but the evidence is strong." "Good, Sarah," she said, her tone softening. "I've known you long enough to know you don't back down, but this fight's going to dig up a lot. Old resentments, old guilt. Are you ready for that?" I march. We both knew what she meant. In family court, the wounds are emotional, not visible. There are no medals, no victories, only survivors. When I got home, Ethan was building a snow fort in the yard. His cheeks were red this time, but from warmth, not cold. I watched him for a while, thinking of how fragile happiness can be, how one act of cruelty can shatter it, and one act of love can rebuild it. I decided then that this story wouldn't end in bitterness. It had to end in balance. Revenge alone wasn't enough. It had to mean something. Later that day, I got a call from Mark. His voice was hesitant. "Sarah, we need to talk." I took a breath. "About what?" "You made a scene the other night. The police report got around the neighborhood." Heather, embarrassed. "Good," I said flat. "You can't just storm into my home like that, Mark. You stopped calling that place home the moment you left our son in the snow." There was a long pause. I could hear his breathing, uneven, defensive. "You're trying to make me out to be a monster." "No," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." I hung up that night. I sat by the fire with Ethan, a blanket wrapped around us both. He leaned against me and whispered, "You're not mad anymore?" I smiled softly. "No," and focused. He looked up at me with those same blue eyes that had 11 belonged to his father. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure you never sit in the cold again." He nodded, like he understood, maybe. He did when he fell asleep. I watched the fire for a long time. Each flicker of flame reminded me of that house, the warmth they hoarded while my son froze outside. I realized revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about reclaiming dignity for Ethan, for every mother who'd been silenced by a system that confused loyalty with love. The paperwork was ready, the court date was coming, and somewhere deep inside me, a quiet certainty settled. This time, justice would wear a mother's face. If you ask most people when their life truly changed, they'll point to a wedding, a graduation, a diagnosis. For me, it was the second I kicked open that door. I can still hear it, the crack of the hinges, the gasp that followed, the way the warm air rushed out into the freezing night. Everything in that moment was burned into memory. The smell of roasted turkey, the laughter that turned to silence, and the way Mark's face drained of color when he saw me standing there in full Marine uniform. Snow melting from my boots. "Sarah, what the—" he started, but I cut him off with those 9 words I'd been holding in for 10 long years. "Get away from my son before I forget mercy." The words didn't come from anger. They came from somewhere deeper. The kind of place you find when you've buried too many brothers in arms and swallowed too many apologies. Heather froze, clutching a wine glass like it was a shield. Mark stood between us, his voice shaking. "You can't just barge in here." "Already," I said. I walked past him straight to Ed. Still shivering on the threshold, I rap and whisper, "It's over. You coming with me?" Mark reached out, his voice rising. "You can't take him." I turned eyes steady. "I'm not asking." The fire popped behind them. The air was thick, not with smoke, but shame. Heather's hand trembled as she set down her glass. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. I looked around that room, the same room where we'd 11 spent holidays together. The walls were the same, but everything else was wrong. His trophies lined to the shelves, now her photos covered mine. It wasn't a home. It was a stage for a life. I no longer recognized you. "You left him outside," I said softly. "In this weather, Mark Stanford?" "It was just for a few minutes." I held up the empty inhaler. A few minutes in 5 degrees can kill a child. His mouth opened, but I saw the realization hit him like a bullet. For the first time, maybe ever, he had no words. I guided Ed into the door. The boy didn't look back. His small hand gripped mine so tightly that I could feel his pulse through my gloves. As I turned to leave, I caught Heather's eyes. There was something there. Not guilt, but fear. Not fear of me, but of what I represented. Accountability. Outside, the wind stung my cheeks. I lifted Ethan into the truck, buckled him in, and started the heater before I could pull away. Mark came stumbling out after us, barefoot in the snow. "Sarah, wait!" He shouted, "Please, just talk to me." I rolled down the window, my voice calm. "Talk? You stopped doing that a long time ago." He took a step closer. It was a mistake. I looked him dead in the eye. "So I was marrying you then." I drove away. The headlights cut through the dark, the tires crunching over fresh snow. Ethan's breathing steadied as warmth filled the cab. He looked at me, tired but safe. "Mom," he whispered. "Yeah, what did you mean when you said those words?" I smiled faintly. It means sometimes mercy is choosing not to destroy someone who deserves it. He was quiet for a while, then said, "You sounded really strong." I had to be. When we got home, I tucked him into bed, gave him his inhaler, and sat beside him until he fell asleep. The rise and fall of his chest was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in years. Downstairs, the adrenaline finally crashed. I leaned against the kitchen counter, trembling. My body was trained for combat, but not for this kind of battle. I poured a glass of water, trying to steady my breathing. My reflection in the window looked back. The uniform still crisp, the face beneath it tired but resolute. Then came the knock. I froze. Through the peephole, I saw flashing lights. Police. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood on the porch, snow swirling around their boots. One was older, gray at the temples, the other young, nervous. "Ma'am," the older one said, "we got a call about a domestic disturbance." "I expected you would." He looked me over, then glanced at my uniform. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Marine Corps." "Yes, sir, Captain Monroe." He nodded. 11, Super, I returned. He lowered his voice. "Your ex said you broke his door." "I did," I said simply. "I also found my 10-year-old son sitting outside in 5-degree weather without a coat or inhaler." The officer's jaw tightened as the boy inside. Yes, safe and warm. He exchanged a look with his partner. The younger one shifted awkwardly. "We'll need to file a report, ma'am." "Do what you need to," I said, handing him Ethan's medical report, "and make sure to note the temperature." They nodded. The older officer gave me a long look before leaving. "You did the right thing, ma'am. Some people just forget what family means." After they drove off, I stood by the door staring at the snow again. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that follows an explosion. I thought of those 9 words. They'd come out almost by instinct, but they were more than a threat. They were a vow, a line I'd drawn between harm and home. When I finally went upstairs, I paused by Ethan's door. He was asleep, his small hand clutching the edge of my old Marine blanket. I whispered into the dark, "You'll never be left in the cold again." In the silence that followed, I realized something that night wasn't just the start of a custody battle. It was the night I took back my dignity. People think the worst pain comes from combat, bullets, bombs, loss. But the truth is, some of the deepest wounds aren't visible. They're signed in I whispered in courtrooms, sealed by silence. That night, after the police left, I sat by Ethan's bed until sunrise. Watching him sleep was both comforting and unbearable. Every breath he took reminded me of everything I'd almost lost and everything I had to protect now. When the light broke through the curtains, I saw the small scar on his wrist, the one he got when he fell off his bike years ago. Mark hadn't even called me that day. The school nurse did. "Your son's fine," she'd said gently, "but he asked for you. He always asked for me." It wasn't the first time Mark had failed him, but it was the first time I truly saw the patterned neglect, raped and charm, irresponsibility dressed his confidence. And the worst part, I used to love that man. We'd met in North Carolina when I was still a second lieutenant, full of grit, ambition, and caffeine. He was a civilian contractor then. Easy smile, soft eyes, the kind of man who knew how to make a woman feel seen. Fellow Marine, the calm, S. But calm turns to complacency, and love when it is an and drifts fast. Mark couldn't handle deployments, the distance, the unpredictability, the danger. "You always choose the Corps first," he said. 11, what about us? I tried explaining that I was fighting for Ethan's future, for the country we said we loved, but my medals made him feel small. And small men do cruel things to feel big again. When Ethan was 6, Mark filed for divorce. I was overseas at the time, running supply routes in Helmand. I came home to an empty house, half the furniture gone, my son's drawings ripped from the fridge. The only thing left was a note. "You made your choice, I made mine." The court battle, that brutal. His lawyer painted me as absent, said I was emotionally unavailable, I sat in that courtroom in full uniform, listening to strangers dissect the kind of mother I was, while the man who'd left me did his best impression of a saint. When the judge ruled in his favor, I didn't cry. I just stood up, saluted the court, and walked out. The Marines taught me to retreat only when it serves the mission, and back then, my mission was survival. Years after that, I lived by the schedule. He allowed 2 weekends a month, holidays when convenient. Sometimes he'd cancel last minute. "Ethan's got plans," he'd say, or "we're out of town." I learned to stop arguing, but the night I found my son outside, that was the line, the final straw that turned silence into action. When I told Linda about it, she leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. "You've got a strong case, and if what you're saying about his condition is true, you might even get full custody." I nodded, but inside, something else was stirring. Revenge wasn't just about winning, it was about restoring truth. I didn't want to humiliate Mark. I wanted him to see what he'd become. That night, I pulled out an old box of photos. Our wedding, Ethan's birth, my first deployment. I held one picture in particular, the 3 of us at the beach years ago. Mark's arm around me, Ethan sitting on my lap and clinging to his cheeks. We looked happy, but I realized that version of him was long gone. The next morning, I called Mark. "Meet me tomorrow," I said, "at the diner on Main Street." 10 a.m. He sighed. "Is this about lawyers again?" "No, it's about your son." He paused. "Fine. The diner hadn't changed since before the divorce. Same faded booths, same smell of bacon grease and old coffee. Mark was already there when I arrived, looking older, heavier, the confidence in his face replaced by something brittle. He didn't meet my eyes. I didn't mean to hurt him. He said, before I even sat down, it was Heather's idea to keep him outside. She thought the cold air would help with his breathing. I almost laughed. You're telling me your wife thought 5 degrees was medicinal? He rubbed his face. I didn't think it was that bad. That's the problem, Mark, I said quietly. You never think, you never notice, until someone gets hurt. He looked up, then desperate. I messed up. Okay, but you can't just take him away from me. I leaned forward, my voice calm but steady. This isn't about taking anything. It's about protecting what's left. He scoffed. You think you're perfect? You weren't even here half the time. I smiled sadly. Yeah, I was overseas, keeping other children alive while you were busy forgetting your own. For a moment, the diner went silent except for the hum of the ceiling fan. He looked down, shaking his head. You've changed. No, I said. I just stopped apologizing. I paid for my coffee and stood up. The court date's next week. Be there or don't. Either way, the truth will show up. As I walked to the door, he called out, Sarah, do you really hate me that much? I turned back and met his eyes. Hate would mean I still care what you feel. Then I walked out into the cold, the snow crunching under my boots. The same cold that had nearly taken my son now felt like clarity, sharp, honest, cleansing. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he whispered, Will Dad be mad? I brushed his hair back. Maybe, but maybe that's what he needs to finally grow up. He smiled. Sleepy, you're not scared of him? I smiled back. I faced worse. And I had, but none of those battles ever meant as much as this one, because this wasn't about pride or punishment. It was about a boy who deserved warmth and a mother who'd learned after years of silence to knock down any door that stood in the way. The court hearing was set for the following Tuesday. In the days leading up to it, the tension felt heavier than any body armor I'd ever worn. I tried to keep Ethan's routine steady, school, breakfast, bedtime stories, but I could feel his quiet fear. He didn't ask about his dad anymore. He just stayed close, always checking if I was there, 11 while brushing his teeth. He looked at me through the mirror and said softly, Are they going to make me go back? Beside him, no one can make you go anywhere unsafe again, I promise. That night, when he fell asleep, I packed his bag for court, snacks, coloring pencils, the small stuffed bear he called Sergeant. I knew we might be waiting all day. The Marine in me planned for every scenario, but the mother in me prayed for one thing: mercy. The morning of the hearing, the sun broke through the frost like a signal flare. I dressed in my service uniform, navy blue jacket, ribbons aligned, silver oak leaf polished bright, not to intimidate, but to remind myself who I was, a protector, a professional, and above all, a mother who didn't back down. At the courthouse, Linda met me at the steps, her coffee steaming in the cold. You looked terrifying, she said, with the green. That's the goal, I answered. Inside the hallways buzzed with whispers and echoes. I spotted Mark sitting with Heather across the aisle. He looked smaller than I remembered, nervous, pale. Heather avoided my eyes completely when the bailiff called our case. The courtroom filled with an uneasy stillness. Judge Reynolds was an older man known for his patience and for his intolerance of lies. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the file, and said, Captain Monroe, Mr. Turner, let's keep this civil. Linda rose first, presenting the evidence. She spoke clearly, precisely like she'd done this 100 times. The temperature report from that night, Ethan's medical records, the statement from the school nurse when she showed the photo of Ethan sitting outside in the snow. A murmur ran through the room. The Heather looked away, Mark's face drained of color. Then his attorney stood, a slick man in a tailored suit. "Your Honor," he began. "This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. My client's wife made a poor judgment call. Mr. Turner regrets what happened deeply and has already apologized. There's no reason to believe the child was ever in serious danger." Linda didn't even flinch. The temperature that night was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The child has asthma. The mother found him shaking, clutching an empty inhaler. You call that not serious? Hesitated, then said, "Emotional reactions don't equate to neglect." Linda smiled thinly. "Tell that to the Department of Child Services, who opened an inquiry this morning." The judge raised a brow. "Is that true, counselor?" The man fumbled his papers. I wasn't aware." Linda turned to me. "Captain Monroe, would you please tell the court what you saw that night?" I stood the room suddenly too quiet. My boots echoed as I walked to the witness stand. I took a breath, steady but controlled, the way we were trained to speak when lives depended on it. "I saw my son outside," I said, barefoot, shaking. He could barely breathe. Inside the house, there was a fire going and music playing. He was out there long enough to lose feeling in his fingers. The judge frowned. "When the home." I told his father to stay away from him before I forgot mercy. The courtroom, STD. Someone coughed. The judge studied me for a long moment. "You're a Marine captain, yes, Your Honor. 21 years of service." He nodded. "I imagine you've seen plenty of danger. Enough to know what neglect looks like, sir. And I've seen soldiers show more care to strangers than that man showed to his own son." Mark shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering furiously, but the judge raised a hand. "That's enough." He looked at Mark. "Would you like to respond?" Mark stood, his voice trembling. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt him." "Heather, stop," the judge said. "This isn't about your wife. This is about your judgment as a father." Here began crying quietly for the first time. Mark didn't reach out to comfort. The judge sighed heavily, then leaned back in his chair. "I've seen many families like yours, Captain. Good people who let pride destroy what's sacred. You've both failed each other, but only one of you failed your child." He looked down at the file again, then back at us. "Effective immediately, full custody of Ethan Turner is granted to his mother, Captain Sarah Monroe. The father will have supervised visitation rights pending completion of a parenting evaluation." That escaped Mark wasn't anger. It was something closer to surrender. Heather buried her face in her hands. The gavel hit 11 hard court. Adjourn. Exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Linda put a hand on my shoulder. "You did it." But I shook my head. "No, we did." What was right? Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, their breath fogging in the winter air. I ignored them. I just wanted to see Ethan. He was sitting in the hallway, legs swinging off a bench, drawing little stick figures on a notepad when he saw me. He jumped up. "Mom, did we win?" I knelt and hugged him tight. "We did, baby, we did." He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in too long. "Can we go home now?" "Yeah," I whispered into his hair. "Let's go home." As we walked out into the parking lot, the air felt lighter. The snow was melting under the sun, slow, steady, unstoppable. Linda waved from the courthouse steps. "Captain," she called. "You sure you don't want to give a statement?" I smiled back. "No statement, just peace." She nodded knowingly. Driving home, I thought about everything we'd lost and everything we'd gained. Justice didn't heal the scars, but it stopped the bleeding for now. That was enough. When we reached the house, Eats inside ahead of me, laughing. The sound filled the walls like warmth after a long winter. Paused by the doorway, looking out at the snow, one last time. It had taken years to learn, but I finally understood. Sometimes victory isn't loud. Sometimes it's just quiet and safe. The morning after the hearing, I woke up before sunrise. The house was still, just the hum of the furnace and the faint rhythm of Ethan's breathing down the hall. I stood at the window with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the snow drift in soft spirals under the streetlight. For the first time in years, I felt peace, but not victory. Victory implies the fight is over. I knew better. In the Marines, we learned that a mission doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when stability begins, when what you fought for is finally secure. That's what this new chapter was going to be about: rebuilding, retraining, restow. When Ethan came downstairs, he was wearing his pajamas and dragging his blanket like a cape. He blinked up at me and said, "Mom, we okay?" I nuzzle-brushed the forehead. "Yeah, buddy, we're okay." He thought for a second. "Will Dad still be mad?" I sighed softly. "Maybe, but anger's a choice. We can't control his choices, just our own." He nodded slowly, the way a child does when they're trying to understand something bigger than themselves. "You are not mad though, right?" I looked at him, those same blue eyes, that same heart that still believed people could change. "No, Ethan," I said, "I'm not mad. I'm disappointed, but not in you, and not even just in your dad. I'm disappointed in how easy it is for people to forget what love looks like." He didn't dance her. He just hugged me tight, that quick, fierce kind of hug that feels like forgiveness in motion. After breakfast, I took him to school. The teachers already knew about the custody change. Small towns move information faster than radio. Mrs. Price, his homeroom teacher, gave me a reassuring nod as Ethan ran to join his classmates. When I got back home, I found an envelope in the mailbox. It was from Mark. The handwriting looked shaky, rushed. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. "Sarah, you got what you wanted. Congratulations. I hope you're happy." I never meant to hurt Ethan. I just didn't know how to handle things anymore. Heather's leaving. The neighbors think I'm a monster. Maybe I am. You always had more strength than I did. Maybe that's why I hated you for it. Take care of him. Tell him I'm sorry, Mark. I folded the letter slowly and set it on the counter. It didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Somewhere inside, it still remembered the man who 11 kissed my forehead before deployment and whispered, "Come home safe." But that man was long gone. That night, I cooked spaghetti, Ethan's favorite, and played an old record I hadn't touched in years. Frank Sinatra's voice filled the kitchen, soft and nostalgic. For a few moments, it felt like life was normal again. After dinner, Ethan asked if he could write a letter to his dad. I hesitated, but nodded. "If it helps you, go ahead." He wrote slowly, carefully, his little hand gripping the pencil hard. When he was done, he read it aloud. "Dear Dad, I still love you, but please don't make me wait in the cold again. Mom says everyone deserves a second chance, but only if they learn. So I hope you learn. I'll see you when the judge says it's okay. Love, Ethan." When he finished, I had to turn away to hide the tears. Later that night, after he was asleep, I stepped outside. The cold bit through my coat, but it felt cleansing now, not cruel. Across the street, the Johnsons were stringing up Christmas lights. The world was moving on quietly, the way it always does after storms. I thought about calling Mark, but what would I? "You are forgiven? Maybe one day, but not yet." Forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't about words, it's about peace. The next few weeks settled into rhythm. The local group part-time and tried to build something normal for Ethan. Every night, he'd line up his stuffed bear next to my old campaign medals on the shelf and whisper, "Good night, soldiers." One afternoon, his school counselor called, Captain Monroe. She said, "Ethan's been drawing pictures of you at work in your Marine uniform." The other kids asked if he misses his dad, and he said, "No, my mom's got it handled." I laughed softly, the kind that comes from equal parts pride and heartbreak. "Thank you for telling me," I said that night. I told Ethan, "You make me proud every single day." He shrugged, smiling shy. "I just tell the truth." And there it was, the simple honesty I'd been fighting to protect all along. A few days later, I got another letter, this one from Heather. "Captain Monroe, you don't owe me forgiveness, but I owe you an apology." That night, the night of the storm, I told Mark to make Ethan stay outside. I thought I was teaching him manners. I didn't realize how sick he was. "I'm sorry if it means anything. I've left Mark. He's drinking more than ever, and I can't fix him. But I hope someday Ethan won't hate me for what I did. Heather." I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. There was no satisfaction in her words, just truth, raw and fragile. And strangely, that truth didn't sting. It soothed. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to prove I was strong. But maybe real strength wasn't in revenge or even justice. Maybe it was in the ability to stay kind, to stay human after everything. That night, I sat by the fire with Ethan again. The room glowed warm and gold, just like the night I found him freezing outside. He leaned against me drowsy and whispered, "Mom, are we done fighting now?" I kissed the top of his head. "Yeah, baby. The fight's over now. We rebuild." He nodded, sleepy. "You always win." I smiled. Not always, but I never quit. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling snow against the windows. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Not for punishment or pride, for peace." Because discipline I'd learned isn't about control. It's about consistency, about showing up every day with love, even when you're tired, even when you've been hurt. And that's what I plan to do. 3 weeks after the custody ruling, I was called back to the courthouse. It wasn't a surprise. Market filed an appeal. Old habits die hard, especially pride. When the notice came, I was sitting at the kitchen table helping Ethan with his homework. The envelope lay heavy in my hands. He looked up from his math sheet and said, "Is it bad news, Mom?" I forced a smile. "Nothing we can't handle." Linda called a few minutes later. "He's not fighting for full custody this time," she said. "He's asking for joint visitation, unsupervised." I closed my eyes. He's not ready. I know, but the judge might hear him out if he shows remorse. I thought about his last letter, the one that said, "I never meant to hurt him." Maybe he meant it, maybe he didn't. Remorse wasn't enough. Responsibility had to follow. The new hearing was set for a Friday morning. I wore civilian clothes this time, jeans, a simple sweater, no uniform. I wanted the judge to see not Captain Monroe, but Sarah, the mother who cooked pancakes on Saturdays and fixed broken toys with duct tape. When I entered the courtroom, Mark was already there. He looked worn down, eyes sunk and suit wrinkled, as if sleep had been a stranger lately. Here wasn't beside him this time. He sat alone when the judge arrived. He looked at both of us. "Mr. Turner," he began, "I trust you've reflected on our last hearing." Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." "And what have you learned?" Mark's voice cracked as he spoke. "That love isn't ownership. That being a father means more than just being there when it's convenient." The judge tilted his head. "I failed my son, and I failed his mother. I can't undo what I did that night, but I'm asking for a chance to prove I can do better." I didn't speak. I just watched. For the first time, his words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded human. The judge turned to me. "Captain Monroe, do you wish to respond?" I took a breath. Your Honor, I don't hate him. I never did. I just stopped trusting him. What happened that night could have ended in tragedy. Ethan's health isn't something we can gamble on. I want my son to have a father, but only one who remembers what that title means. The judge nodded, and if Mr. Turner demonstrates responsibility, then I'll meet him halfway. I said quietly, not for him, for Ethan. The room fell silent. The judge studied us both, then leaned back. This court doesn't often see two parents speaking from honesty instead of anger. I'll take that as a good sign, Mr. Turner. Supervised visitation will continue for now. After 6 months, we review. Mark nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. He just whispered, "Thank you," when the session ended. I walked out into the cold air. Snowflakes drifted down, light and slow. Mark followed me into the parking lot. "Sarah?" he said softly. It turned. "Yeah, I meant what I said in there. I know. I'm trying to get sober. Heather's gone. I started therapy." I studied him, the tremor in his voice, the slight slump in his shoulders. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing. He was just a small human. "That's good," I said. "Keep going." He nodded. "Can I see him this weekend?" "Supervised. Yes, Linda will coordinate." He smiled faintly. "I'll take what I can get." I nodded and turned to leave. But before I got in the truck, I said, "Mark, you still have a chance to be the father he deserves. Don't waste it." He blinked hard, whispered, "Captain, I didn't expect that." It was the first time he'd said those words to me, and somehow it meant more now than it ever could have before. When I got home, Ethan was building a snow fort in the yard. He ran me eyes bright, "Mom, look, it's got a flag." He'd stuck one of my old Marine patches on a stick and planted it proudly in the snow. I laughed. "That's regulation, unauthorized use of insignia, soldier." He giggled. "You can't court-martial me. I'm a kid." "Noted," I said, grinning. That weekend, Mark came by for his supervised visit. He brought a small Lego set, the same one he'd promised Ethan months ago but never delivered. They sat on the floor piecing it together quietly. I stayed in the kitchen listening. Ethan's voice carried softly. "Dad, did you really leave me outside 'cause I was noisy?" Mark froze. Then he said, "No, son. I left you outside 'cause I wasn't being a good dad. I'll never do that again." There was a long pause. Then Ethan said, "Okay." Just that, okay. No anger, no judgment, just a child, simple grace. When the visit ended, Mark thanked me before leaving. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his keys. "I know," I replied. "Just don't stop that night." I sat by the fireplace while Ethan slept upstairs. The house glowed in soft orange light. It was the same kind of warmth I'd 11 seen behind that other door. But this time it wasn't built on pretense. I thought about forgiveness, how it's not something you give because someone deserves it. You give it because you deserve peace. Mark had a long road ahead. So did I. Being strong didn't mean building walls. It meant knowing when to let them down. Before bed, I wrote in my journal again. The mission isn't to win against the past, it's to make peace with it. Then I turned off the light and let the silence settle like snow. Spring came slow that year. The snow melted into little rivers that ran along the curbs, and the trees behind our house began to bud again. Each morning, I walked Ethan to the bus stop, coffee in one hand, his small backpack in the other. The cold had finally broken outside, and in it had been 6 months since the last hearing. Mark had kept his word. He showed up to every supervised visit, never late, never angry. He'd even started volunteering with a local veteran support group. His therapists sent updates to the court, and 11, the reports were good. I didn't trust easily, not after everything, but I'd learned something through all of this. Growth doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's quiet, unsteady, honest. That Saturday, I got a call from him. His voice was calm, sober. The judge approved unsupervised visits, he said. Would it be all right if I took Ethan into the park tomorrow? I hesitated. Was still that protective mother instinct, the Marine who wanted to check every perimeter before giving permission. But then I looked at Ethan sitting on the floor, building another Lego fortress. He deserved to see his father trying. Yes, I said, but bring him back by dinner. The next day they went to the park. When they returned, Ethan ran in ahead of him, cheeks flushed with excitement. Mom, Dad, let me drive the RC car, and we got ice cream. Stood at the door, hands in his pockets, unsure if he was allowed to come inside. Come in, I said finally. He stepped into the living room. The house smelt like fresh coffee and laundry, simple, domestic peace. He looked around, eyes resting on the photos on the mantel. Ethan's school portrait, my old unit photo, and one of the three of us from years ago, faded. And, Christ, you kept that? He asked, quiet. I noted, it's still part of Eth's story. He smiled faintly, then grew serious. Sarah, I owe you something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter and a folded photo of Ethan, about a year old, bundled in a blanket sleeping on Mark's chest. I found it while cleaning out the attic, he said. I used to look at that picture every night after you deployed. I tell myself I was strong enough to handle everything, but I wasn't. I let my resentment grow until it ate me alive. When you were the only one actually fighting for us, I listened quietly. The crackling in the heart, he continued, voice low. That night when you kicked the door open, I saw you. The way I used to, not as my ex-wife, as the woman who never backs down. I hated you for that strength, but I finally understand it. He looked up, eyes glassy. I can't undo what I did. But I can make sure Ethan never doubts who loves him, not again. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me wanted to stay guarded, to keep my honor on. But another part, the one that had spent sleepless nights praying for closure, knew this was it. I walked to the fireplace, took the letter, and placed it gently beside the old family photo. Then start showing up, I said, not just for him, for yourself. Ethan ran into the room, then holding his Lego ship. Dad, look, it's done. Mark crouched to admire it. That's perfect, buddy. Can we all eat dinner together? Ethan asked suddenly. Mark looked at me uncertain. I hesitated for just a second before nodding. Yeah, we can. We ate spaghetti again, the same meal as the night after the first court ruling. It wasn't fancy, no grand gestures, just 3 people at a table finding their way back to something that resembled peace. After dinner, Ethan fell asleep on the couch, still holding his toy ship. Mark stood to leave. Thank you for letting me stay. He said thank you for being civil. I replied. He hesitated at the door. Sarah, do you think you could ever forgive me? I looked past him to the night outside, calm and quiet. Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing, Mark. It's something you earn day by day. But you're on the right road. He nodded slowly. Then I'll keep walking. When the door closed behind him, I turned back to the fireplace. The flames flickered softly, reflecting against the family photo and the letter beside it. I picked up my journal and wrote, 20. Today, I learned that forgiveness isn't surrender, it's strength. Wearing gentleness, the war ends when you choose peace, not because they deserve it, but because you do. I stared at the words for a long moment, then I underlined them twice. A few minutes later, Ethan stirred awake. Is Dad gone? Yes, sweetheart, but he'll be back. He smiled, sleepily. You promise? I promise. He nodded, curled up, and drifted off again. I added another log to the fire and sat down beside him. The warmth filled the room, soft and steady. Outside, the last patches of snow glowed under the moonlight. This was what peace felt like. Not fireworks or applause, just quiet hearts finding their rhythm again. Before turning off the lamp, I looked directly at the camera of my phone, recording the end of this story, for the listeners who might one day need it. My voice came out calm, sincere. If you've ever felt powerless if someone you love betrayed your trust, don't let it harden you. Let it teach you strength. Isn't about who shouts the loudest or wins the fight. It's about who keeps showing up with love even after the fire. I paused, glancing at Ethan sleeping beside me. Remember, forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. And sometimes that's the quietest kind of victory. The fire popped softly, filling the silence. If this story touched you, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear it. That second chances exist, not just for others, but for you too. And if you've ever stood in the cold wondering if you'd ever feel warmth again, I promise you will. I smiled, eyes wet but peaceful, sending good night. The camera light blinked off, the fire glowed low, and I let the silence hold me, not as a soldier, not as a wife, but simply as a mother who had finally come home.